Today, we're going to look at important people of the American Revolution. George III was King of England during the American Revolution. Now, one of the first things he did, which angered the colonists, was that he issued the Proclamation of 1763. And if you remember, this was a line that ran roughly along the Appalachian Mountains, which told the colonists they could not go west of the Appalachian Mountains into Indian territory. And of course, this upset the colonists and was one of the early problems between the British government and the colonists. Parliament was the English lawmaking body. They passed laws which angered the colonists. Laws like the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Quartering Act, and the Sugar Act was all legislation which Parliament passed which angered the Americans because they were not represented in British Parliament. Remember, the phrase "no taxation without representation" came from these acts. Samuel Adams opposed British taxation and formed the Sons of Liberty. Now here's Sam Adams right here, and the Sons of Liberty were responsible for one of the most significant acts in American history, and of course that is the Boston Tea Party, in which they threw over 300 crates of tea into the Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. Patrick Henry spoke against the Stamp Act and strongly supported independence. In a speech to the House of Burgesses, he proclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death." And what Patrick Henry said in this statement is that many of the colonists were willing to fight and die as opposed to living under British rule any longer. Crispus Attucks was an African American who was killed at the Boston Massacre. Was the first casualty of the American Revolution. And so again, here's a picture of the Boston Massacre, and you can see Crispus Attucks, who was the first casualty of the American Revolution. Mercy Otis Warren was a woman playwright who wrote plays making fun of the British. She was also an early spokesperson for women's rights. So the plays that Mercy Otis Warren wrote made fun of the British, and it was just another way that the colonists protested the way they were treated by the British government. Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. He said the colonies had nothing to gain by remaining part of Britain. This pamphlet convinced many Americans to want independence. Now, you've seen this quote by Paine before, in which he said, "I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense." John Adams was a member of the Continental Congress and a member of the committee in drafting the Declaration of Independence. So here's a picture of John Adams, who eventually becomes one of the early presidents of the United States. George Washington was the commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And here's a picture of Washington addressing his troops. And of course, Washington eventually goes on to be the first president of the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. There's a picture of Jefferson, who also becomes one of the early presidents of the United States. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, was an early advocate of women's rights. Was concerned that the Declaration of Independence said nothing about women. Now, if you look at this passage here from Abigail Adams, she said, "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So what Abigail Adams is saying is that women should have a voice in the government. Wentworth Cheswell was an African American patriot who fought at the American victory at Saratoga. Cheswell is an example of many African Americans who fought on the Patriot side and helped win independence for the colonies. Benjamin Franklin was the ambassador to France and helped convince the French to help the colonies after the Battle of Saratoga. Now, if you remember, the Battle of Saratoga was the turning point in the American Revolution because after this American victory, France began to help the colonies. James Armistead was an African American who spied for the Americans. He posed as a runaway slave, and the information he got from the British helped the Americans win their independence at the Battle of Yorktown. So here's a picture of James Armistead, and his efforts helped the Americans win their independence at the Battle of Yorktown. Haym Solomon was a Jewish businessman who helped fund the American Revolution. His most important contribution was giving money to Washington's army right before the Battle of Yorktown. Remember, during the war, the colonies were plagued with lack of money, and private citizens like Haym Solomon oftentimes would loan the government money. And in this case, the money he gave to Washington helped win American independence at Yorktown. John Paul Jones led raids on British vessels and helped inspire American confidence with his defeat of the British warship Serapis. Now, one of the more famous quotes that came out of the American Revolution is the quote attributed to John Paul Jones during this battle, in which he says, "I have not yet begun to fight." His victory in this battle inspired American confidence and helped the Americans win their independence. Marquis de Lafayette was a Frenchman who fought in the American Army during the Revolution. It was at Valley Forge and Yorktown. And here's a picture of Marquis de Lafayette. And remember, the French began to help the Americans after the Battle of Saratoga. And without France's help, the Americans probably would not have won their independence. Bernardo de Galvez was a Spanish governor of Louisiana who protected American ships at New Orleans. He also transported war supplies and took up arms against the British in helping the Americans. And here you see a picture of Bernardo Galvez's force fighting British forces, and the Spanish, like the French, helped the Americans win their independence. Baron von Steuben was a Prussian military officer who trained Washington's troops at Valley Forge and turned them into a well-trained professional army. So here's von Steuben right here. And remember, during this time at Valley Forge, it was a very difficult time for Washington's forces, but von Steuben came in and turned his army around into a very well-trained, disciplined army, which eventually led them to victory at Yorktown. To review, remember, there was a wide variety of different peoples and countries who came together to help the Americans win their independence from Great Britain. And of course, this colonial victory in the American Revolution led to the formation of the United States of America.